Okay, I already see that we have someone from BC, which is great. I also see someone that shared that learned about time management today already. So, time management in the morning and critical thinking in the afternoon sounds an amazing schedule for today. I'm seeing someone from Ottawa. Welcome. Oh, and I even see someone from York. That is great. I'm very happy that you all decided to join us today.
All right, Katarina, you ready to get started?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, let's do it.
Okay, so for new entrants, I just want to say welcome and introduce myself. My name is Katerina, and I'm going to be one of the co-facilitators for today. And I'm joined by Becca, which is also uh, my co-facilitator and a lovely, actually, facilitator. So hopefully, between me and Becca, you'll have an amazing time. So we like to start our workshops with a land acknowledgement. And although I know we are not all in the same location, we recognize that many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. The area known as Sacramento has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Innu, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with 1.1 Bell Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. And we have a link for you with one extra resource if you are interested in to learn more about the importance of the land acknowledgements. Since critical thinking is our topic, we like to not just jump into conclusions, but try to look for and understand the background of the information. So I think that is a lovely resource that we have here for you. Okay, a little bit about Learning Skills Service and what we do. Once again, we are a York University resource. We are available for all our students, and our goal is basically help students achieve academic success. We do that by building knowledge, skills, and confidence in a lot of learning skills areas and topics, such as critical thinking that we're going to be discussing today. So what to expect from this workshop? Our main expectation from me and Becca is that this is a very interactive workshop. We don't want to be here talking for an hour. That's boring. We want to hear a lot from you. We want to hear your opinions, your perspectives, your examples. That's why we are all here for, to learn from each other. So we really appreciate your participation throughout the whole workshop. We're going to use Slido, which is an online tool. When it comes up, one of us will explain it, how to access it, but it's very simple. Other than that, if you have questions throughout the workshop, feel free to add it to the chat, and we're gonna do our best to try to answer all of your questions. If you're also in mood for, you can always use the reactions throughout the workshop. And the last thing I want to mention is that you can access the workshop sites, and they are going to be on the web page for the session on the PAW platform. Okay, so the guidelines for participation. The first one is for you to take care of yourself. If you need to get up and stretch, if you need a little break, feel free to do so. Other than that, we ask you to be respectful both while listening and speaking, keeping in mind that we all have come from different backgrounds, therefore you're gonna have different perspectives, but we are here to learn from each other, that is great. Other than that, know that this workshop is confidential, so we want to make sure you're comfortable to share your opinions here and participate. And one last time, I'm going to reinforce how important for us it is that you ask questions and take risks with your learning. Okay, and the agenda for today, so we're going to start about talking about what why do we think that critical thinking is important. Then we're going to talk about what are the main characteristics of a critical thinker. We're going to focus on what critical thinking is. And lastly, for the content part, we're going to talk about what are the main skills and what are the strategies that we can use to improve those skills. And the last part of this workshop, we're going to have a practice activity to put in practice all the information that we're going to discuss throughout the workshop. And with all of that being said, I think it's time for us to start this workshop, and I'll pass it to Becca to start us off.
Thank you, Katerina. All right, so like Katerina said, we're going to start off thinking about why critical thinking is important. So here we have our first Slido on the screen. So you can either scan the QR code with your smartphone, or you can go to slido.com and put in the hashtag PAW2025. And when you do that, you should be able to see this content on your device. So what I have on the screen here are a couple of different scenarios that you might encounter in your everyday life. And I want you to indicate which of the following scenarios involve critical thinking. Okay. So some of the scenarios are getting a text while driving and deciding whether or not to look at it, describing the weather, seeing an ad for a pair of shoes on Instagram and deciding whether or not to buy them, inferring how your friend is feeling based on their facial expression, remembering your email password, selecting sources for an essay, determining whether a news story is real or fake, and taking notes in class by writing everything the professor is saying. So I see one person has joined Slido here. If you're having trouble, let us know in the chat and we'll help you join here. You can also feel free to put your answers in the chat if that is a little more accessible for you. So which of these following scenarios involve critical thinking? Anyone having trouble joining? Okay. All right, we got 2 people in here. I'll give you another minute. I've got 3, that's great. All right. Gonna give you 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's take a look at the results here. All right, so selecting sources for an essay for sure requires the critical thinking. Getting a text while driving and deciding whether or not to look at it. Yes. We're split 50-50 here on remembering your email password and determining whether a news story is real or fake. Okay, describing the weather. Most of us think doesn't quite require critical thinking. And seeing an ad for shoes on Instagram, maybe not so much. Okay, interesting here. All right. So one take-home message that we want you all to get from these scenarios is that critical thinking can apply outside of your academic life, right? So it's not just critical thinking is a light switch that you turn on when you're in class. You really do use critical thinking skills in every area of your life, like deciding whether or not to respond to a text while you're driving, okay? Or selecting sources for an essay. So some of the things on here that don't require critical thinking are remembering your email password, describing the weather, and taking notes in class by writing everything the professor is saying. So all of these things have something in common, and I'm going to tell you what that is. Okay. So when we are remembering or describing, or even kind of at the core level understanding something, these are lower levels of thinking and learning. And when we think about our purpose in university, It's not to graduate, or at an institution, right? It's not to graduate having memorized a bunch of facts. We really want to advance to these higher level critical thinking skills that include creating, evaluating, and analyzing. Okay. So we have to be able to look at things from different viewpoints and find and assess evidence that address important questions and be able to find and develop creative solutions to problems. Okay, so these are all higher levels of thinking that we want to be able to develop by the time we're finished at our institution. Okay, so this is the goal. So like I said, these lower levels, remembering, understanding, these are foundational. These are still necessary. They're still important. And we can't stop there. We need to really advance to these higher levels. And that's what a big goal of being at a higher ed institution is all about. Okay. And why is this important? We think back to the scenarios on the past slide. Okay. Again, critical thinking can apply in a wide array of areas of our life, not just university. Okay. So in order to be a functional, responsible, active member of society, we need to be able to do these things and think critically for ourselves. All right, Katerina, can you tell us a little bit about some critical thinking misconceptions?
Yes, sounds great. Actually, now that we already focus on where we are using our critical thinking skills in the Bloom's taxonomy, different levels of thinking and learning, let's focus a little bit of time in misconceptions that are associated with critical thinking. And how we are going to do so is by Slido once again. So you can scan the QR code or you can go to slido.com and the code is PAR 2025. The link is also in the chat if it's easier for you to access it that way. But basically, we're going to provide you three different scenarios. And what I want to know is if those scenarios are false or true. And then we're going to discuss why. Okay, I see that we already have two participants. 3, 4, 5. That's great. 6. Okay. A couple, 5 more seconds before we start. And I think we are ready. Okay. So the first scenario that we have for you, or sentence, is graduating from university automatically means that you are competitive and qualified for a job in your chosen field. Do we think that is true? Do we think that is false? I see some of you were very quick to answer. Okay. Okay, so all of you said that that is false, and you are absolutely right. That is false. And the thing is that recent research has shown that graduate students, when they start working for the first time, although they have a lot of theoretical basis, they might lack some skills that are also relevant for your career and for the work field. And those skills revolve around problem solving, analytical reasoning, and even effective communication. And I don't know if you noticed, but all those things are related to an extent to critical thinking. So you are all correct, which means that I can get the idea that we all kind of are in the same page on what is critical thinking, which is great. Okay,
We are,
next sentence.
oh yeah, we are off to a good start here. Here is your second question. Generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI, will soon be capable of critical thinking, so I do not need to develop these skills for myself. True or false? Remember to push send on your answers. All right, we got 5 out of 6 here, and I'll reveal the results in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, so we've got a little bit of a split here, and the correct answer is false. So Gen AI is really rapidly evolving, right? Every day, every hour, every minute, Gen AI is getting smarter and more advanced. But there will always be skills and tasks that AI can't do as well as we can as humans. And that is something that makes us unique. And that also means that we have to maintain the ability to think critically for ourselves. All right, and here is our third question.
Perfect. The third question is, I'm responsible for ensuring I develop critical thinking skills, not my professors and not my institution. Do we think that is true? That is false? We already have 4 answers. 5. We are waiting for one last person. Or maybe we can figure it out if it is true or false. Oh, so it's not very clear, but it's actually true. I see that some people say that it's false, but I know ideally in a world that works perfectly, the way our classes and courses are structured would be in a way that we have time in class to learn about those skills and develop. However, that is not the reality in a lot of situations. So in those cases, it's our responsibility to be proactive and take action in order to try to develop those skills.
Oh, Kaylee takes the leaderboard. Way to go. All right. Our next section here is what critical thinkers are like. So we've touched a little bit on the why, we've touched on some misconceptions about critical thinking, and now we're really going to dig into the what of critical thinking, starting with what critical thinkers are like. So while we might associate critical thinking with certain skills, it can also be associated with a certain mindset or certain traits and characteristics that people have that make it helpful to engage in critical thinking. So can anyone pop in the chat, maybe some traits or characteristics that come to mind of what a critical thinker is like? What comes to mind? If I say, oh, Katerina is a really good critical thinker, what traits or characteristics do you think that she might have? Oh, reflective. Okay, love it. Yeah, that's a great one. Curious, good about why and how things work. Nice. Curious and open. Oh my gosh, I'm going to pause because we are 3 for 3 right now and I need to move on because you are hitting these all on the head here. Okay. So here are some different traits that we have of individuals who have a critical spirit. Okay. So like we saw in the chat, they're inquisitive, they're curious, they ask why, and then why again, and then why again. They're open-minded, they're flexible in considering different viewpoints and alternatives, right? They're reflective and analytical, right? And systematic. They can act according to a fixed plan. They're judicious, which means that they are fair in how they appraise others' arguments. So they're avoiding or at least aware of some of their biases. They're truth-seeking, so they want to be well-informed, and that is something that they value. They're confident in their reasoning, okay? So they have this inner self-confidence in their capability of being a good critical thinker and being able to reason through problems. And again, they're analytical, right? So they are aware of opportunities where critical thinking is appropriate and where they should be able to apply it. All right. So I love this. And now that we know about some of these traits and some of this mindset, we have a little bit of a self-reflection here for you. So like Who said that in the chat? Navneet said in the chat, a critical thinker is reflective. So we are going to practice that right now in the Slido. So remember, this is anonymous, but I have a couple statements on the screen here, and your job is to rank them from hardest to easiest. Okay, so take your time, read through a couple of these and lock in your answers. Which one of these statements are hardest for you to the easiest for you? So as you're doing that, I'll read some of these out loud. Okay, so being courageous enough to ask tough questions about some of my longest held and most cherished beliefs. Showing tolerance toward the beliefs, ideas, or opinions of someone with whom I disagree. Encouraging peers to not automatically dismiss the opinions and ideas other people offer. Think about group work. Being willing to honestly reconsider a decision. Organizing a thoughtful, systematic approach to a question or an issue. Attending to variations in circumstances, contexts, and situations in coming to a decision. Thinking ahead and anticipating the consequences of various options. And making a serious effort to be analytical about the foreseeable outcomes of my decisions. And approaching a challenging problem with the confidence that I could think it through. Okay, so there's a lot here. I know there's a lot to reorder. Take a moment and reflect and lock in your answers. I'll give you another minute or so. Okay, we've got 2 answers locked in here. All right, so the top 2 are being courageous to ask tough questions about long-held and cherished beliefs, thinking ahead and anticipating consequences. Ooh, okay, attending to a whole bunch of information that's coming at us in order to make a decision. Good. Thinking ahead is up there. Oh, whoops, organizing a thoughtful approach to questions is up there. Okay. Nice. All right. So it's always interesting when this one pops out because being courageous enough to ask tough questions is up there quite commonly. I think that's an interesting one, but I like that connection to bravery and courage in the context of critical thinking because sometimes it's hard and we have to rely on that flexibility, right, to change our perspective if we need to. Thank you, everyone. All right, I'm going to pass it back now to Katerina.
Perfect. So reflecting on what we've done so far, we covered why we think critical thinking is important and what are the main characteristics and mindsets that we see typically on a critical thinker. So now it's time to focus on what critical thinking means. And with that being said, I have a challenge for you. So the next slide is going to be a word problem. I give you a couple of minutes for you to read, and I want you to put in a chat to write it, your first answer, what you thought of the first time. But don't enter already. Just have your answer ready, and when I say 1, 2, 3, we can all see like a waterfall of answers and see if they are common or not. Okay, hopefully you're ready. Maybe a time's up? Yeah, I see a time's up. Perfect. So the word problem is a bat and a ball together costs $1.10. And we know that the bat costs $1 more than the ball. So my question is, how much does the ball cost? I'll give you a couple of seconds to reflect on it. Write your answer in a chat, but don't send it yet. Okay, hopefully, you already came up with an answer. So I'm gonna count until 3, and at 3, you all send your answers to the chat, okay? So 1, 2, 3. Let's see what are the answers. Okay, I see 10 cents. I see 5 cents. I see 10 cents again. 10. Okay. Uh, Another 10 cents. That's interesting. Okay, so actually, for all of you that answer 10 cents, that is the most common answer that we got when we asked this question. However, that is not the correct answer. The correct answer is 5 cents. So congrats to Yunji. That is actually the correct answer. Good job. So moving to the next slide, I'm going to try to explain why this question is relevant in this workshop. So our process of thinking, for our process of thinking, we like to use the dual system model. And we have here two systems. The first one, it is used on situations that are familiar to you or that you are in a time pressure situation. So you're gonna rely on your intuition, your past memories and experiences, and find those mental shortcuts to get to an answer as quick as possible. The other system, system two, is is necessary to have a little bit more effort, and it's more deliberate because you need to reflect. It relies on the evaluation and judgment of the information that is like being thrown to you. And we are normally use it when, first of all, the situation is unfamiliar, or it's in a situation that does not revolve an immediate question, so you do have time to reflect. So my question here is, for the bad question, what dual system were you using when you answered 10 cents? Can I see an answer in the chat? Do you think is you, when you were answering for the word question, the word problem, you were using the system one or you were using the system two? The system one, exactly, because I was pressuring you to give me an answer as fast as you could. However, for critical thinking, when we want to apply critical thinking, what system do we want to use? System two, I see in the chat. Exactly. You are absolutely right. So, although it's very clear the differences between the two systems, they're not necessarily one is better than the other. Actually, they work together to improve our critical thinking process. And with that being said, I want to just keep a little note here that as any other model, they are susceptible to bias and they might make mistakes. So just don't rely 100% on this model because it will conduct you to mistakes from time to time.
Great. Thanks, Katerina. All right. As a little review here, what we've learned so far is that critical thinking exists as a mindset. and it's paired with specific skills, which we're going to get into in the next section. Okay, so the takeaway messages so far is that critical thinking takes effort and analytical thinking, as we saw in the bat and ball question, right? Most of us were prone to making an error because we were trying to go fast and maybe not taking the time to really break down the problem. Critical thinking also involves asking questions, finding evidence, being objective, being reflective. These are all things that we've touched on in our discussion so far, which is fantastic. Notably, critical thinking is not attacking or criticizing. It's not based solely on emotions, personal values, or your beliefs, although those can be useful in some ways. And it goes beyond simply describing a concept or a theory, right? So remembering Bloom's taxonomy, we're going from the foundational levels to the more advanced higher thinking levels. Okay. So in the next section here, we're going to go into the how. We're going to go into the skills and talk about specific strategies that we can use to help ourselves be better critical thinkers. So I'm going to skip this Slido, Katerina, and pass it back to you.
Lovely. So exactly as Becca mentioned today, as of right now, we're gonna talk about the most important part of this workshop, I would say, which is actually how can we improve and develop those skills. And the first one we have here is interpretation. And interpretation is all about making sure you understand the concept or the information that you are reading in an article, learning at school, whatever it is your situation. And the strategies that we have for you to make sure you actually understand the content is to summarize. And summarizing is basically when you're able to either write or say out loud a little description of the main ideas. And something that is important for you to use when you're summarizing is paraphrasing. So we don't want you to just copy or like word for word whatever is saying on the article or whatever all everything that you are listening from your professor in class. Actually, we want you to listen or read about it, reflect a little, and then try to explain it in your own words. But when we are summarizing, we want to make sure we have the main ideas. And how do we make sure we include all the key ideas is actually by asking questions. Questions that we want to have answered in our summary. So we have some examples here. Why is this happening? Why do we think it is important? What are the implications? And so on. And having the idea that we need to create questions for us to be able to write our summaries, I would really appreciate or be really happy if you're able to embody the energy of this little girl while you are reflecting on what are the questions that you need to answer in your summary. So this is a little funny clip for us, but the idea is to actually keep asking questions and more specifically open-ended questions that are thought-provoking, and you will need to reflect and go through the content to actually be able to understand them. And once you do it, you just have to compact it in a little summary. The last thing I want to mention in this slide is when you're done with your summary, it is always good to go back and look to the original text because we want to make sure that we are not missing any key information regarding that topic. So don't forget that little go back and compare at the end of your summary.
Thanks, Katerina. I like that connection also that you made back to like the difference between writing down everything your professor is saying and paraphrasing in your own words, right? So that's a clear difference. It's the same type of context, right? One has critical thinking because you're paraphrasing, you're putting things in your own words. The other is not critical thinking because you're just writing down everything that you hear and not processing the information as they come in. Nice. Okay. Our second skill here is analysis. So this is being able to critically analyze information. So detecting arguments, identifying similarities and differences, and identifying assumptions. So for the specific strategy that we're attaching to this skill, we're going to zoom in on identifying and challenging assumptions. Okay, so assumptions are claims or theories or statements that we take for granted and we accept as true. But some of those assumptions are untested or unfounded, and we have to be able to recognize when that is the case. So take the example that we have on the screen here of treat others as you want to be treated. Can anyone take a guess, put in the chat or unmute? What is the underlying assumption of this statement? Treat others as you want to be treated. Might feel a little more obvious. Okay, so Kaylee says in the chat, we want to be treated well or kindly. Paulette says equality. Juliana says we're reactive. Eugen says that others will treat you the same way as you would treat them. Good. Okay, these are great answers. Yeah. All right. So the underlying assumption here is that others prefer to be treated exactly as we do, right? Or that others' preferences are identical to our preferences. So an example that I use is when you are in a taxi cab or an Uber, and say that you love to talk, you love to chat. So you get in the Uber and you're like, I love to talk. I'm assuming that my Uber driver loves to talk. And so you start up a conversation, right? But as you may know, if you take Ubers and cabs and stuff, that people have different preferences, right? Some people like to ride in silence. Other people like to have casual conversations. But when you assume that the person that you're riding with has the same preference as you do, that could get into awkward territory if those preferences actually don't align. Okay, so that's an example of how this is a very common phrase, a very common adage that is actually an assumption, right? And that's something that we often take for granted. But when we take time to examine it a little more closely, we see that there might be, we might run into trouble, right? If we take this as it is, or if we assume that this assumption is true across all contexts. And like we saw in the chat, right? Kaylee said, oh, we want to be treated well and kindly. That might be a condition or a context where the assumption does make sense, right? Like that's probably safe to assume that most people want to be treated well, right? But it doesn't apply in all cases, in all contexts. So that's where we need to get our critical thinking going and ask ourselves when an assumption might be true and when we might need to question it a little bit further.
Perfect. So the third skill, it is evaluation. And evaluation is about assessing the evidence that is being used to support the main points. However, relating to critical thinking, we don't want to just focus on what is the evidence, but more specifically, we want to go through what is the quality of that evidence. So for that, the strategy that we have here is assess the evidence. So another, again, a little bit of reflection, thinking about, does evidence support arguments that are being made? If so, what is the kind of evidence that is being provided? Do you think that that evidence is strong enough to support the points? Do you think that maybe there's any evidence that is being left out? If so, what are the reasons behind that? And so on. And besides the focusing or reflecting on the supporting evidence that's being shown to you, it's also important to focus on the quality of the sources that we are using. Hopefully, they will be trustworthy and unbiased. But not all sources, not all articles that we find on the internet have those characteristics. So, a tip that we have for you is to make sure that when you're learning and for school, you're using scholarly sources. And scholarly sources are basically sources that were reviewed by other scholar peers, and they follow a very strict rules and guidelines to make sure those articles and those pieces of information are okay to be published. I don't know, maybe not all institutions have exactly the same services, but until a certain extent, I'm sure your institutions, your college or university have like a service that will help you find those sources and make sure that the sources you are using are scholarly sources. For me, here at York University, we have the library, and the library has their own service that help us guide us through what are scholarly sources and what is not. But I'm sure that with a little bit of research, there's something that you can easily find out. And it is something that I would recommend you to do. So it is worth to waste or take a little bit of time to make sure that you have the right sources in your learning journey.
Right. Our next skill is making inferences. Okay. So when you hear the word inference, you might be taken back to a science class or a psychology class where you've had to form hypotheses, come up with alternatives, draw conclusions from results that you have. And when we think about this skill, we also might think of reading a lot of articles and weighing the pros and cons of the evidence for and against a claim and deciding which side has more evidence or stronger evidence, and then deciding what perspective we believe. And this is one way to make inferences, but the other way is a little bit more diffuse. It's a little bit more creative. It's a bit more imaginative. So when we're making inferences and we're thinking critically, you don't have to put yourself in a box, right? It's okay to think a little bit more broadly and outside of the box in order to generate fresh ideas or come up with alternative explanations. So a strategy that can be helpful here is called a thought experiment. So this is a little more philosophical. It's a little bit more imaginative. And it's where we go into our minds to think of possible solutions for problems that we might not be able to make experiments for in the real world. Okay. So some thought experiments can be tested in the real world, others can't. And that's okay, right? So this allows us to think outside of the bounds of what might be possible, and come up with different creative types of ideas. So a famous example of this is when there were two competing theories of gravity. So Aristotle thought that heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. And Galileo came along and said, if I walked up to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped two objects of different weights off, I think they would actually fall at the same speed for these reasons, right? So this is an example of where he challenged an old theory by thinking of, well, what if I did this and this happened? And that eventually came to be the more prominent theory of gravity. Okay. And a fun fact here is that Galileo's theory was actually proven 400 years later by dropping a hammer and a feather on the moon where there is no gravity and finding that they fell at the exact same rate. Okay. So this is a nice strategy to think of because it might be contrary to what you think of critical thinking, really analytical, really systematic. But critical thinking can also be a little bit more loosey-goosey and more diffuse.
Okay, so explanation, it is the next skill that we're going to talk about. So assuming that now we already read through an article, we already evaluated and reflected on the information that was being presented. We went through the evidence and we made our judgments about if we think it's enough, if it's not, if it makes sense, if it's not trustworthy, and so on. We came up to our own conclusions, and that is all great. But that leads us to the explanation. So now it's time for us to put all of our ideas and like all the processes that we kind of went through while we were going through the article into an actual writing format. So basically, an explanation is when you give like a full picture of all the information in all your questions or your
Oop, Katerina might have frozen. Did she freeze for you?
to go through.
Sorry, we lost you for a minute.
Oh, sorry. Where was I?
Well-reasoned arguments.
Okay. If you went through all of that, now it's time for you to be able to put it in like a journal picture, either by you doing it on a writing, maybe you are writing an essay or something like that, or like explaining. So for example, if you're explaining the information and you're able to adapt the vocabulary, but still keeping the right information to a kid, but also to a grown-up, that is a pretty good indicator that you actually understood your processes, the content, and your conclusions. And for doing that, the recommendation that we have here, once again, is the resources that most likely are free and available to you. We have the Writing Center that help us focus on how to write, how to put our ideas from just thoughts to actual structured sentences and so on. Also, resources on how can we improve our writing skills, which is a skill that is very attached to critical thinking, especially at university levels. So once again, I want to point it out that you might not have exactly the same resource, but I'm sure you have similar ones. And I recommend you to take the time and look through it, because if it's there, if it's available to you, why not just take advantage of it and improve yourself a little bit?
All right. And our last skill that we want to highlight is self-regulation. So again, this was brought up in our discussion earlier, which is the importance of self-reflection for self-correction and our evolution. Okay, so the strategy here is reflection, which is where at different points when we're using critical thinking, we have to check in and see how we're doing, right? How much of our biases are maybe coming forward that we need to put in check. How flexible are we being when we're considering others' viewpoints, and maybe do we need to be a little more open-minded? How are we perceiving a particularly difficult task that we have in a certain class, right? Maybe do we need to reframe how we're approaching it? So using these opportunities for reflection is really helpful because when you're doing that, you're critically thinking about your approach to critical thinking, which is really helpful to check in terms of your progress, right? If this is a skill that you really want to get better at, or you really need to get better at to be successful in your course or to be more well-rounded, it's good to check in and do those progress checks and see, oh, okay, what am I doing well? And what could I maybe do differently going forward? All right. So we've thrown quite a bit of strategies and skills at you. And so now it is time to practice, to put those skills into action. So for the last 10 minutes that we have you here, we are going to work together because something super odd has just happened. An extraterrestrial from another planet has just crash landed at a university. but they have no idea what the word university actually means. So I quickly wrote a description, but it really, really needs to be refined. Okay, so we need to kind of tweak it and make it better. So on the next slide, you'll see the description. And we want you to use your critical thinking skills to help us to revise the explanation of university for the alien so it's a little bit more accurate, okay, and on point or reflective of reality. Okay, so on the next screen, we're going to see the description. Katerina is going to annotate for us and put your thoughts. We invite you to put your thoughts in the chat or unmute and see what we can find and how we can make this description a little better. Keeping in mind that we want to interpret, analyze, evaluate, infer, explain, and do some self-regulation. All right. So here is our description. University is a place where young adults go to get a degree so they can get a job. Students take classes from professors who teach them new information and skills. University is very fun, and most people graduate easily and on time. Okay, so what are your interpretations of this description, and what do you think is a little off or problematic? Feel free to unmute or put some thoughts in the chat. We can zoom in on this first sentence here. University is a place where young adults go to get a degree so they can get a job. How do we feel about that statement? Accurate or no? False. Paulette says false. Can I invite you to expand? What part of that sentence needs to be changed? Or if someone else wants to add on? Okay, Nicole has in the chat, is it only young adults, right? Is university just for the young people? What do we think? Yes, no? Thumbs up, thumbs down? No, right? All right, so Katerina, if you could please scratch out the young part. I think we can keep the adults, but young is not accurate, right? So that might be an assumption or a stereotypes. Yeah, and Paulette says in the chat, right? Not all students are young adults. There are mature students, and we're happy to have you, Paulette. And Juliana here says, it's also not necessarily to get a job, but to acquire specific knowledge. Good, I like that. So this is getting at the assumption, perhaps, that everyone is at university for the same purpose, right? To eventually get a job. Good, so that's good identification of another assumption. Okay, what about this last statement here? University is very fun and most people graduate easily and on time. How do we feel about that? Would you characterize university as easy and fun all the time? Not all the time. Okay. So there we might, let's say I wrote this statement, right? We might have a little bit of a personal bias going on in this explanation. Maybe that's my experience. The university is fun and easy and I'm in and out, right? But that doesn't apply to everyone. So when we're trying to explain the concept of university to someone who doesn't know that, we need to check and make sure that those biases, those personal biases, are not present in our explanations. Yeah, so now the chat is going, right? It's fun sometimes, but it's mostly hard work, 100%. The experience is not the same for everyone, and sometimes it can take different time or different amount, a different number of years, depending on what degree and what program you're in. Also accurate. Not everyone graduates on the date they wanted to, right? Right. So getting to the easily and on time part, right? Okay. So thank you so much for your participation here. But you'll see this is 3 sentences, right? And we already pulled out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different issues having to do with assumptions or biases. So even in this silly example, when we actually use our critical thinking skills, we can find that there is quite a bit of improvement that we can do and when we really zoom in on the text. All right. Okay. Back to you, Katarina.
Perfect. So it's time to wrap up. A little review from this workshop. Now we hope that you're able to describe why critical thinking is important. Remember Bloom's taxonomy and how we want to achieve and stay in higher levels of thinking and learning. For that, we need a bunch of characteristics and mindsets. So you're now hopefully able to identify the characteristics of critical thinkers. Also, you're able to identify the skills and the strategies that we can use to develop those skills. You're also able to reflect on the current state of critical thinking characteristics and skills that you have as of right now and try to develop a plan for your future to improve them. Lastly, we hope that you're able to apply those strategies, not only in situations like Becca mentioned 3 or 4 words, like the example we use, but in a more general and broad framework in your career as student, but also we prove in a lot of examples that is applied to your future career and even in your personal level too sometimes. Okay, we have one last Slido question for you here, which is what are the takeaways from this workshop? Here we want to know if there is something particularly that me or Becca said that stood out to you. What are the things that you might want to apply in the future? What are your takeaways, basically? You can scan the QR code and put it in the bank question, but you also can put it in the chat if it's easier for you. No? Oh, okay. Um, I will go with Nicole. So while hopefully you're all typing your answers, what are your main takeaways? I will say that on behalf of Learning Skills in New York University, we appreciated that you took the time to join us today. And hopefully you were able to learn something new and have a good time for this hour that we were here all together. I see that Juliana said that I like the strategies you guys presented, and you will definitely try some of them on. That is very good and very nice to hear. And no problem. Okay, even the ones that didn't share the takeaways, I hope you had some, and I hope you are able to apply the information that we talked through this workshop in your lives. With that being said, we really appreciated that you came today. I don't know if Becca has anything else to add. Oh,
Ooh.
I see. I have taken critical thinking workshop in the past, but this one is the best. Oh, thank you so much. That's definitely a way to make us feel good. We really appreciate it.
Love that. We are close to time here, but if you have any questions that you wanted to ask before heading out, we're happy to answer any that you may have. So are there any questions y'all have before we sign off for the day? Paulette, Dorette, any questions? All right. Thank you so much for coming and for participating. Done. All right. Have a good rest of your day.